Welcome to Love Your Library, Hampshire Libraries podcast. I'm Kate Price-McCarthy, here with my co-host Mary Stone.
Hi, Kate.
This edition of the podcast is, it's a bit different from our normal podcasts, as we're doing it all about one author. Because before we started doing these podcasts, we talked about who would be our dream authors to interview. And there were a few names recommended by library staff that just came up again and again.
And one of those names was former Children's Laureate Michael Morpurgo. Or should we say Sir Michael Morpurgo, as he was knighted last year.
So we were over the moon when he agreed to meet up with us to talk about his latest book.
Michael's written a huge number of books, well over 100, which is an amount only topped, at the moment, by Enid Blyton. His books include dozens of much-loved titles, such as Warhorse, which was famously and successfully adapted by the National Theatre and by Steven Spielberg.
As well as Adolphus Tips, which is probably my family's favourite, Alone in the Wide, Wide Sea, and Butterfly Lion, which has just been adapted by the Chichester Festival Theatre. Like many other families, I'm sure, Michael Morpurgo's stories are very much part of my son and daughter's childhood. We used to, if we were going on a family holiday, we would get a Michael Morpurgo on audiobook, and then on the long car journey, we would listen to it, and we would always end up arrived at our destination, having to sit in the car and listen to the last half hour because we had to hear the end of the story.
His books are not books that you can just put down halfway through. If I was listening to it in a car journey, I think I'd do exactly the same.
He is the master storyteller.
His latest book is Boy Giant, Son of Gulliver. It's about Omar, a 12-year-old refugee from Afghanistan, and is inspired by Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels. In the book, Omar is trying to find his uncle in England, but ends up on the island of Lilliput. Let's hear what Michael Morpurgo had to say about the book when you met up with him. We're going to start by hearing the man himself read from the start of the book.
Boy Giant, Chapter 1. Tiny, they called me. All we knew about her was that she called herself JJ, that she spoke English, that she was alone out there in her big yellow rowing boat, and that she was like a giant to all three of us, even me. A giant with a bandaged wrist and plasters on her fingers. So tell me, she said, tell me everything. I could hardly refuse, could I? I mean, this JJ had saved our lives. It was thanks only to this stranger that we were dry again, well fed, warm and rested. I mean, she went on, I want to know how it is that you're out here in the open ocean in such a small boat. Who are you? Where have you come from? I could have asked her much the same questions, but I found myself telling her our whole story. I was happy to tell her too. Not just because she had shown us such kindness, but because once I began telling her our story out loud, it somehow helped me to believe it had all really happened to me. Helped me to remember who I was, who I had become. That she would believe me, I had no doubt. After all, she had the evidence right in front of her. She could hardly take her eyes off the evidence. The three of us were there to prove it. We were the truth of our own story. I began at the beginning because without the beginning, none of it would have made sense to her, and anyway, none of it would ever have happened. I would never have had to leave home, and my life would have been another story altogether. It's quite a long story, I told her. That's fine, she said. I need to rest this wrist anyway. I can't row far like this. So I began. Where I come from is no longer my home. There was a house and a village I once called my home in Afghanistan. I had a family of my own once, not anymore. I have my name, Omar, and I have mother, but I don't know where she is. I think and I hope she may be in England with Uncle Saeed. I was on my way to find her. That's why we were out here in our little boat when you found us, and we found you. I don't know any more what day or month or year it is, but I think I must now be about 16 years old. Of my beginnings, of my home, there's not much to tell. And I don't like to speak of it or think of it, because it makes me sad to remember. My home was a quiet place. in a peaceful town in the countryside. We lived on the edge of town. My father was a shepherd. Our flock was our livelihood. We never went hungry or thirsty. I had a little sister, Hanan. She and I were much loved in our home. We were together. We were all happy. School was school. All my friends were there. We learned our lessons, played together. But as I was always small and thin, and at school I was never allowed to forget it. Tiny, they called me. Little I may have been, but I was by far the best at cricket. No one hit a ball harder. No one bowled faster. The pitch was always bumpy, but it was the same for all of us, and it was fine. Everything was fine. I could read the bounce of every ball they bowled at me, see it onto the bat. I lived for my cricket and my family. Everything was good. Well, mostly. Every night I went to sleep wishing I could score more runs the next day or take more wickets. And I prayed I would be a little taller in the morning. I would measure myself against the mark Mother had made on the wall. The next day I would often score more runs or take more wickets or both, but I was never any taller. Hanan was still taller than me every morning, and she was 2 years younger than me. Then the war came to our town, and I had other worries, more serious worries. I do not know to this day why the war came. It was on the morning of my 10th birthday, I remember that. We heard the planes in the sky, and then the bombing began. We were in school. There was nowhere to hide, nowhere to run to. At the end of that day, our home was in ruins. Our school, too. Many of my friends had died. I was there when they were buried. I helped to bury them. Father died, too, when the planes came again the next morning. And so did most of our sheep. And then we discovered Hanan was missing. We looked and we called, but we never found her. Only Mother and I were left. We had nothing. No shelter, no food, no father, no sister, no daughter.
Can you tell us a bit about your new book, which is Boy Giant, Son
Boy
of Gulliver?
Giant. Boy Giant grew out of, as almost all books do, various different routes. The first route, an important route, is that Michael Foreman, my oftentimes illustrator and dear friend, suggested to me approximately 25 years ago that we should do a retelling of Gulliver's Travels. At the time, I didn't really want to, because I knew the book well enough to know that Jonathan Swift, when he wrote it, did not write it for children to enjoy Lilliput and a big giant lying on the beach all pinned down. That wasn't the purpose of it. Lovely that idea is. He wrote it, and he said this in his own language, to vex people, because he felt that what was going on around him in the world was corrupt. It was grim for vast numbers of people who had little or nothing. It was warlike, it was cruel, and he was having a go at the world around him and telling a sort of parable. So I thought, well, you can't just retell the cute part of it for children. It's been done before, and we did something else. And then, I don't know, 3 years ago, Michael said to me, you know, we still haven't done Gulliver's Travels. And I said, well, I know, I told you, why not? And he said, well, think about it. So I was thinking about it when, up on my television at some point, came this image of a dead child being carried along a beach in Italy or Greece, or it doesn't matter where it was. What it matters, it was a dead child, it was a dead refugee who had, with his family, struggled to come to Europe because this was the great hope for these people. And I was very upset by that. The whole world was very upset by it. And then we saw more such images, and they keep repeating themselves, and we all know the history in recent years of this flood of people running away from hunger and starvation and war and disease, trying to find some kind of a life. And we also know, sadly, how many people in rather well-off Western Europe have turned their backs on these people. And I feel extremely uncomfortable to be part of that society. That's the first thing. So there came this need somehow to address this. And then in a way I got lucky and I got unlucky. A dear friend of mine, who was a producer on the film of War Horse, said to me, look, I want to go. I'm very concerned with what's happening in the jungle in Paris, in Calais. Would you like to come with us? So we went along and we visited the jungle. 3,000 people sort of locked in, shut in behind barbed wire, patrolled by police with guns and living in the most filthy, stinking, ghastly conditions. And they were all young boys, all of them, away from their mums and dads and living in this ghastly, hellish limbo. I sat in a tent with a whole group of these people and I couldn't speak their language, they couldn't speak mine. But I don't know why it happened. We all sort of held hands in this tent and we started singing songs. They sang their songs, we sang our songs. It was an expression of solidarity and I felt it very deeply when I was there. And then shortly afterwards, love the story, it also comes into Boy Giant really in a funny way. Another dear friend of mine had approached us because we live in the middle of Devon and she had this idea. She used to visit asylum-seeking refugees, mostly from Afghanistan, who had been cooped up in sort of hostel accommodation in Croydon because they were wretched. They were in despair, they were depressed. And she was searching her mind for something to lift their spirits. And then she suddenly discovered there was something they all had in common, these boys. They all loved cricket. So she arranged this cricket tour of these Afghan boys to leave Croydon, get in a bus, come down, arrange it with us to the West Country, to where we live, and stay in a big house, which we have down the road for where the children who come to farms for city children, my wife's charity, on the farm. Beautiful place, lovely old Victorian house looking out towards Dartmoor. And they were going to stay there. It was during the holiday time, so they'd come and stay there. And I arranged with my local village team, which was run from the pub in Iddesleigh, a little village. I said, would you like to put up a team to play against these Afghan boys? And they said, oh yeah. I think they thought they were going to win easily. Well, they didn't. I watched these Afghans play and they played with unbelievable conviction, hit the ball harder, ran faster, bowled harder. And they beat Iddesleigh, and then they went on and played 4 other matches. They won every single one of them. They came back the next year and did the same thing. And the pride they got out of it, the joy they got out of actually playing with us, you know. We were in this strange country and we played the same game as them. It was the most beautiful, beautiful moment. And they would say things like they'd be sort of having tea in the middle, in the interval, and looking out towards the hills of Dartmoor and said, oh, it's just like Afghanistan. You know, the mountains of Afghanistan. It's all in their heads, this link between their country and our country. So I was profoundly moved by that, and I thought, maybe there is purpose now in writing this story, that I will, yes, use or some of the wonderful things that Jonathan Swift wrote, but I will use it for the same purpose, which is to vex people. I don't particularly want people to enjoy this. I'd love them to read the story and want to know what happens, but I also want them to realize and empathize with what it is these people go through. And so I created this wonderfully sort of Shangri-La ideal of Lilliput, which of course had been visited by the real Gulliver 250 years before, and who'd left the seeds of their society there, the society which rejected selfishness and belligerence, and where the ethic was to live for each other. And I thought, well, this is the only way we're ever going to survive as a people and as a species is to do that. So yeah, create that society and have a refugee of today from Afghanistan who plays cricket washed up on the beach of Lilliput and sort of see what happens. So there we are, that's the roots of it. I tend to inhabit every character I possibly can. That's why you'll find in many of my books the main character is called Michael. And even in Butterfly Line, it's called Michael Morpurgo. It's ridiculous. I can't have the time to... There's something about being inside a story enables you to inhabit it. And with every story I write, I try to do that. And if I don't do it completely, I never think the story really works. It's the only way I can make something work is to be inside it, to act it. I think deep down in my genes, my DNA, I'm an actor. My mummy was an actor. My daddy was an actor. I didn't become an actor, sadly. But I think to inhabit a story while you're speaking it, as they do, as I saw last night on stage here, the Butterfly Line, they have to believe it before you're going to believe it. The actors are not convincing, and they're just acting. It doesn't work. If a writer is just writing to make a book, and the reader knows it doesn't work. You just have to live it. You look the person in the eye through the writing or the stage play, and you mean it, you really mean it. It's not a plaything. And whether it's old retellings or new stories, I do the same.
At the heart of this story, the story of Boy Giant, is the power of generosity and kindness, and the importance of building bridges to join us rather than walls to separate us. And of course, as you were saying, the power of cricket. So is that sense something you feel it's really important to remind people of?
Yes, I suppose I do. I mean, the wonderful thing is that cricket does exactly that. All great sport does that. It brings people together. All great culture does that. Books do that. And all these bridge-building cultural exercises are really important. We live in a world which is fast falling apart at the moment. Doesn't seem to know that the glue that holds us together is what matters. That's the whole thing. And day after day, we get reminded that not just here but all over the world, people are finding reasons to break apart and break apart. And where we work as a wonderful species, a creative species, is when we find common cause in some way or other. We find common understanding. And I love it. So, for instance, when I hear that the play of Warhorse is going to China, or it's going to Japan, or it's going to Australia, what I'm joyful about is that I know that something which began its place in Iddesleigh, in the middle of Devon, spreads around the world. They're not telling you actually everything is Britain is wonderful. It's not. It's a film about war, the most terrible thing a man ever created for herself or himself. And we were part of that, the heart of the whole business of the First and the Second World War. I write about it a lot because I'm very engaged with this whole subject. And it's important we're not portraying ourselves in some propagandist way, but that we are passing on the message of common humanity, that there's longing for peace, which actually we all have until it's perverted by other people. So, it's a common theme, and in Boy Giant, it's as strong as ever, I think.
Yeah, and it's like, that we are more alike than we are different.
We are, and I think the thing that it's really important too is we all get to know this Omar, and we get to know him. He's not a migrant. He's not an asylum seeker. He's a son. He's a brother. He's a person, and we get to know him as such. And that's where we've gone so wrong. We talk about these people, if they're another kind of people. And they're just like us, they're the same. They may live in places where there are mountains and rocks and the houses aren't built the same, but they play cricket. I mean, I know that sounds silly, but there is something they share with us. And of course they share a love of family, a love of country, maybe their religion as well. There's all sorts of things we share together. And I just feel that's the most important thing to talk about with young people at the moment who are aware that they don't know any more actually than we do, the complexities of what's going on at the moment. But they're aware that these shifting sands, and they're very unsettled by that. I think it's not an accident that so many children are suffering from mental breakdown and illness at the moment. The society is unsettled. People around them are unsettled. Nothing is... You can't sort of trust and believe in things. I mean, when I was growing up, it was not an ideal society by any manner of means. It was just post-war, and everyone was pretty miserable, to be honest. It was cold, it was grey. But there was a but, and the but was that we all played together, We didn't have a machine to go to at all. You could listen to the radio if you really wanted to, most of it didn't. You did this thing called playing out. You played out in the street, and there were hardly cars, and so the street was yours. And the bomb sites were yours to play. And there was all sorts of ways where we all joined in together. We got to know each other really well. Not to love each other, but to know each other. And that was really important growing up. And we got to know a little bit of history because there were photographs on the mantelpiece of people who died in the Second World War, and we saw the grown-ups being upset by all that. So we were connected to what had come before. We didn't just dismiss it as being unimportant. I think belonging is maybe the most important thing we've got to feel about each other. And I mean, what's really interesting about the whole migrant question at the present moment, we can call them that just for the sake of this podcast, these people who have nowhere to be, who need to find somewhere. And they come to us from all corners of the earth. And there is this sense in which This is the first time this has happened. Isn't it terrible, this wave of migrants coming? Why can't they, for goodness sake, with an American president saying, go back to where you come from? It's in people's head, the very fact that someone in that kind of authority could say such a thing, not just about women or black women, but about anyone who is coming to your country. When your country, America, is packed, it doesn't have an existence without its migrants, that is who they are. And actually, we don't like to think it, but that's exactly who we are as well. I mean, superficially, let's examine the royal family. Where do we think these people come from, Were they sort of, was it from Boadicea, these people? No, they came from Germany, from Austria, from France, from Belgium. They are our kings and queens. Europe! And you think, what are we fussing about now? It's just extraordinary. My grandfather came over here. He was a migrant. When he came over, he was Belgian. And then, you think of the wonderful lady in our world who wrote the Tiger Who Came to Tea, Judith Carr. Where did she come from? She's German. She's a Jew. And she came over here at a time when actually people here thought it was really important to look after such people. Didn't look after them well enough. Of course we didn't. And we didn't look after nearly enough of them. But this woman came here as a little girl. She adopted this country adopted her. She felt she belonged. We most certainly wanted her to belong. And she's become this iconic storyteller for the English. And she wrote in English. She painted in English. Did she heck? She wrote her stories for everyone. And the lovely thing was that in her old age, she was going back to Germany and talking to the people there, and then coming back here and talking to people here. She was a migrant, and that's what people forget. They're real people, and they make either the best of their lives or not the best of their lives, just like the rest of us,
There seems to be this common thread through your work as a writer, but also in your past life as a teacher and the work you do now with the work you've been doing since the 70s with your wife Claire for the Farms of City Children, that you feel it's important to make a difference if you can, and to change people's lives where you can. And is this something you find as a writer that you almost have a responsibility to do?
Most people, I think, who grew up in the time that I grew up and who were middle class, we had enough, also had this notion that it was part of your function to help other people. It was there, not because you were a desperately strong Christian, it was just what people did. And so it wasn't just middle classes. I think everyone thought this was how we were going to play it. And then at some point, we mustn't be too political, but at some point, people started saying there is no such thing as society. That, you work for yourself, you get rich for yourself. And suddenly the things changed. The whole way the boat was pointing, changed. And it's gone on since then. So we now have this very angry society where those who have are doing fine, they do what they like. And those who haven't are simmering because it is not being shared out. This culture, this extraordinary wealth. I mean, people endlessly go on and say, do you know, we are the 5th or 6th richest economy in the world, and they say it with great pride. Well, it's something to be proud about, providing it's shared out. And when it comes to the planet, it's the same thing. We've just gone blindly on, doing what we want to do, exploiting it, whether it's the animals or the sea or the air or whatever. That's what we've been doing, enjoying it. And my generation, I mean, I'm to blame. My particular generation, in my 70s now, have probably had the best 70 years in terms of having a comfortable existence, doing what we want, going where we like, but in the most extraordinary way, keeping ourselves blinkered from the consequences of what it is that we're doing. And it's the young who are now telling us. And they're quite right to remind us, and we have jolly well got to put it right. But I really think what the real shame is that my previous generation left us a world of freedom. They left us a world where they got us out of this hole of fascism and all this sort of stuff. And they were really saying to us, here's your world, make the best of it. And we haven't made the best of it. And we're handing on to our next generation. The degree of difficulty is just unbelievable they're going to have to face. And it's been us. I don't blame them for being angry.
No, I know. I'm looking at my children's generation thinking, thank goodness for them, because they do seem to have their heads screwed on, hopefully.
Well, that's the thing. And hope Hope does spring eternal, but hope won't be any use at all unless it's fed by the intellect and emotional clarity of some sort or other. And books help that. That's what books do. They enable us to think. They push us into places to understand. So when we read about an Afghan refugee, maybe for the first time, you begin to think, hang on, I know this person, he's actually like me. And you begin to empathise with other people from other countries and a different age and a different time. And all that's really, really important to us, I think.
Yeah, the power of books to make us be much more able to empathise with people.
Yes, and it's much more important. I mean, I know we can muddle up with stories and stuff. It is more important than film. Because film serves it all up for you. There was someone directed wonderfully and acted beautifully, and
they play the right music.
They just play it, absolutely, and you respond to what they are telling you. Books aren't like that. Books you have to make this intellectual effort for, and play is the same. Last night we were watching this absurd situation of puppets on a stage, lions. It was Africa one moment, and then it was Sussex the next moment. It just kept changing, and you believed everything. But you had to do the believing. They had to convince you, just like a writer does. But the intellectual effort you had to make is so much deeper and so much more profound. That's the truth of it.
He was an absolute delight to talk to, such a lovely man. And there were loads of things I'd have loved to have talked to him about, but just didn't have time.
Okay, so what kind of things did you want to talk to him about?
Well, about the way he writes, because he talked about the way he gets so involved and becomes the characters when he's writing, that when he wrote at a desk, he used to give himself terrible back problems because he'd be all hunched up and tense over his desk. So, at the advice of his friend Ted Hughes, what a great name to have as a friend, he started writing standing up, which was apparently how Ted Hughes used to write. But then, of course, he got problems with his feet. So then he chanced on a photograph of Robert Louis Stevenson, who is Michael Morpurgo's literary hero. And he saw that he was writing in bed with the book propped up on his knees. And he thought, well, if that's good enough for Robert Louis Stevenson, then it's good enough for me. So he started writing in bed. First of all, he did it in his bed in his house, but apparently he kept getting ink and muddy boots all over the bedding, and his wife said, no, that's no good. So now he's got this tea house in his garden with a special writing bed inside it.
Oh my God, I think I want a special writing bed. I'm not sure I'd get anything done, but it just sounds cool. I'm going to my special writing bed. But you haven't done any writing? Yeah, but no, I will.
Yeah, had a good nap. I think
had a good nap, that's what I would probably do.
But I'd also like to hear him talk about the journey to become a writer, because it wasn't straightforward at all.
Yeah, he was a bit of a drifter at first, wasn't he? I read that he hadn't been an avid reader as a child and didn't really know what he wanted to do, or even if he had any talent or anything. He went into the army, then he became a teacher, which he absolutely loved. And it was there that he discovered he could tell stories, which caught the interest of children in his classroom. His head teacher at the time heard him telling one of these stories and got him to type it up, which they then passed on to a publisher, and that was it.
I'd have also liked to ask him about, in his most recent book, Boy Giant, the quote right at the start of the book, because it's such a great quote. It is, be not inhospitable to strangers, lest they be angels in disguise. I knew it sounded familiar, but I had to look it up, and it's by a man called George Whitman, who ran the Shakespeare and Company bookshop in Paris, which many readers and writers will know and love and revere. And the quote is still up above the doorway in one of the rooms if you go there, so that's worth looking out for.
Oh wow, that is actually really beautiful. Normally, in this part of the episode, we visit a Hampshire library to get some book recommendations. But having Michael Morpurgo as a guest got us talking about our own different favourite books of his. And we decided for a change to make our recommendations from our guest author's huge choice of titles. So I met up with 3 young women who grew up reading his books. They are Aysha, Hattie and Francesca, who all work with me and Kate in our team, and we all got together to have a talk about the Michael Morpurgo books that they recommend and why. With me today are 3 members of the office team at Hampshire Libraries, Hattie, Aysha and Francesca. So not the people you might meet when you visit your library, but all working for the service and all equally as passionate. And they're all keen Michael Morpurgo fans. Aysha, I'm going to turn to you first. What was your book selection?
So I chose the amazing story of Adolphus Tips, and it was really interesting actually because it's talking about a bit of history that I didn't really know anything about, which is just before the D-Day landings. I think kind of actually a few years before, I guess the British Army knew that they were planning these attacks. And so they took a lot of like beach seaside towns in the south of England, and basically they had to be evacuated by all of the citizens that lived there because they needed empty beach kind of cities and towns to practice these landings. So what happened was very quickly a number of towns across England had to be evacuated for the army. And this book follows one of those towns. I think it was Slapton, and that's evacuated. I think they have 7 weeks or so to get out, and the story follows a girl called Lily. She has a friend called Barry who's come down from London, and it's their adventures as they have to evacuate. And Lily has a cat who does not want to evacuate and keeps wanting to try and go back into the now abandoned town, and it kind of follows that, and it explores the impact of the war and the kind of relationship between citizens and the army and stuff. It's a really fascinating book because it talks about a really interesting piece of history, but with the kind of lovely character of Lily, who's this really strong, really feisty young girl who's a great character, and her cat, which is also lovely. And I'm a big cat fan, so I just think it was a really lovely book and really well done.
So what was your favourite bit about it?
I think it just does a lot of things at the same time. So kind of before reading it, it looks like it might be a kind of book all about an animal, which is a really nice way to get people interested, because I think particularly younger readers often might have a real attachment to a pet and love animals, and it's a nice way of exploring. And by kind of going into it that way, you don't realise necessarily that actually it's about a much bigger thing than just an animal. But for me, I think Lily was my real standout. She's such a great character. And I think actually across all his books, he tends to have these really strong female characters, which I think is really great. So I think Lily for me in the book she was a great character. I really liked reading her.
I think one of the things that is really quite clear about Michael Morpurgo is he tends to use quite similar ways into his narratives, and using animals as a way into a story is something that we see time and again. So we've got it here with Adolphus Tips, we've got the cat. We'll be talking about it again in the next book, Butterfly Lion, got a lion. Obviously there's Warhorse. Do you think that appeals to adults as well as kids?
I think absolutely. I'm a real animal lover myself, and actually I never read Adolphus Tips when I was little, so I've actually only just read it recently, but as an adult I still really enjoyed it, and I knew I'd like it because, as I say, I'm a real cat person. I think in some ways his books, they work for adults and children because they allow you to kind of get back into that childhood frame of mind a bit. The writing doesn't try to be kind of pretentious. It just is a lovely story, and he writes really beautifully and tells stories simply but really effectively. And I think as an adult you're able to appreciate how children would read it, but also read it with maybe the knowledge that you have and kind of understand the nuances and the things behind the scenes. But I think an animal is a really great way to do that because it gives any reader of any age something to be able to chat about and to discuss, and it's often something that can be quite an emotive thing. I think people feel quite strongly about animals.
It's an emotional hook, isn't
exactly,
it? Yes,
I think
very
so.
clever.
Also for children, often their first kind of knowledge of something dying is maybe a pet, so it's a good way of getting that emotional hook and then being able to teach people about the history or whatever he's discussing in the book. So I think it's very effective.
Francesca, you read this book. What did you think?
The things that stood out with me the most with Adolphus Tips was the fact that Aysha's briefly mentioned on it, is the fact that you're learning something new about history as well. And I also really like the friendships that were in the book. We have the friendship between the townie Barry and then the local Lily, and they become pretty much brother and sister at the end of the day. He moves in with her. But then it also explores the friendship between Lily and Addie, the I think he's an American soldier who's come in to help with the evacuation and all the D-Day landings and stuff. And their friendship kind of evolves throughout the book. And I particularly liked seeing that because, of course, with the ending as well, it was a nice little ribbon on the tie.
We won't give away the ending.
Won't give away the ending, no. But I think that was the thing that stood out for me, was the friendships that he'd written about. That's what stuck the most.
Let's move on to Francesca now to talk about the next book, which is Butterfly Lion, is that right?
Yes, The Butterfly Lion. This book has very fond memories for me. It was one of my favourites growing up. It was the book that was on my bookshelf that I would always reach for first. It has such fond memories, and I loved it, and I loved reading it again now as a 23-year-old woman. So the book is basically about a young boy called Bertie, and he lives in South Africa on a farm with his mum and dad. It's just him. He's very, very lonely. And one day his dad went out on the game and killed a lion, which obviously isn't very pleasant, and he knew that there was a lion cub out there that was just orphaned. So he goes out to try and find this white lion cub, which of course is very rare. And, you know, he brings him in, he finds him, he actually saves him from, I think it was hyenas or something. And he brings him in and they keep him, and the friendship again blossoms. And in a sense, it's kind of like the lion saves him from all the loneliness, and they become best friends and inseparable at the end of the day. And then his parents unfortunately want to move him away to England, to Salisbury, Wiltshire, to go to a boarding school, and therefore he has to sell the lion to a circus, which he was very unhappy about because he just didn't think that the lion would get treated very well, and he's his best friend at the end of the day. So we fast forward a few years, he hates boarding school, you know, he's so miserable, so lonely, and he tries to run away. He runs away from the boarding school, and he, on his adventures, meets a girl called Millie, and he tells her all about this white lion cub that he has and how one day he's going to find him. And of course Millie doesn't believe him, but they build up a budding friendship over kites and all fun things, and they sneak every Sunday on the top of the hill to meet each other, and it's quite a sweet little friendship that starts to blossom. And then as everyone ages, he then goes into the war, gets given the Victoria Cross. So fast forward into the future, Bertie and Millie reunite in a hospital in France, and then they go on a adventure together looking for, of course, the white lion cub. And we hear the story from a different person's point of view. We're hearing it from the future, and it's wrapped up in a nice ending, which is one of my favourite parts of the book.
This is one of the things that really strikes me about Michael Morpurgo books, or the ones I've read anyway. I mean, he has written many, many books, as we know, but all three of the books that we discussed today fit this kind of format where he puts a story within a story. It starts with one narrative that then veers off into a story, usually in the past, and then comes back to the point where we started the book, and it is wrapped up in that fashion. I think that's quite an interesting way to tell a story. But do you find that maybe he uses this too much as a technique? What do you think, Hattie?
It's a good way of playing around with, you know, chronology and timing and future and past, kind of having those moments that interplay with each other and often that cycle back to the beginning. Having these kind of cycles and framing devices that place stories within stories, it's a really great way of kind of cementing that narrative in your mind.
I think as well it's a real testament to the power of storytelling and how stories, kind of sharing of stories, is the way that we remember history or remember or explore things that happened. I think, as Hattie was saying, it's a really interesting way of framing it, but it feels then more like a story that you might be told by a family member. And I think often these stories are from maybe a grandchild hearing about a grandparent, and I think that's such a lovely thing. And I think sometimes we lose that in this day and age. It's kind of everything is live in the moment and kind of always looking to the future. But I think a lot of his books are about celebrating the past and exploring the stories that are at our fingertips. You know, your grandparents might have some incredible stories, your neighbour, your, you know, friends, things like that. And I think it's celebrating rather than creating a story out of nothing. It's finding those things that actually happened. And for children, it's a really lovely way of saying, you know, maybe speak to your grandparents about things that might have happened. And it's a lovely kind of framing device, I think, in terms of just the kind of the power of storytelling in a way.
That really fits with what Michael himself said in his interview when he was chatting to Kate about how those relationships when his generation were growing up with their parents who lived through the war, and the photographs that they saw and those conversations they had, they could keep that connection to the past. And he was reflecting on the fact that we have devices giving us sort of instant gratification now, and the way cinema kind of leads the narrative and to think and feel in a certain way that you're kind of you're sort of told what to think and feel, whereas you have to do a little bit more work with books. But he helps you with these narrative styles. What do you think?
I totally agree with Aysha and Hattie, and one thing that I've kind of noticed with the story within the story is that in quite a few of his books, it's also told from a child's point of view and an adult's point of view, which is obviously quite nice, as when I was a child I could relate looking through the younger person's eyes and kind of more relating and understanding a bit better. But now reading it as I was older, I kind of relate more to the older person as well. So it's quite nice to see it from two different ages perspectives, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. So the thing about these books is that they're so rich for adults and children, and you think what a beautiful book to read, any of these books really, to read to a child. So I think there's something that everyone can get out of them.
Absolutely.
Okay, we've been talking about Butterfly Lion by Michael Morpurgo, and that was Francesca's choice. Now, moving over to you, Hattie, and you're going to tell us about Alone on a Wide, Wide Sea.
It's a story of two halves, really, because it's this childhood in Australia from the perspective of Arthur, who's, I think, about 6 years old or 7 years old when he's starting on the voyage. And then the second half of the book is told from his daughter's perspective many years later, as she embarks upon her own voyage to kind of reclaim a lost family member. I don't think it's like the other two we've mentioned. It's not a hugely heartwarming story from the first impression when you look on it. It tackles some really difficult themes like abuse and sort of imprisonment in a way, and it's not always an easy read. It's not got those really heartwarming elements that maybe are characteristic of a Michael Morpurgo tale.
He's adopted by, he's one of many, like a group of children that's adopted by this couple, and they think they might be going to this new family, but actually it's slave labour basically on a farm in the middle of nowhere in Australia. So it's not the paradise that some of these children thought that they might be going to when they were on the boat. I mean, Alone on a Wide, Wide Sea is a fascinating book because it deals with a moment of history, of British history, of sending children to Australia for apparently a better life. This went on for quite a long time, and it was a lot of children that were orphaned that were sent away. I mean, you look back now and you just think, what were people thinking, that this was a way to treat young, vulnerable people? But what a fascinating way to inform people now of what happened in the past, because this book, yes, it is incredibly challenging, but it's still a children's book. It has the language is perfect for children. The way they deal with difficult issues, it doesn't go into too much grim detail. It does it just enough to tell you what's happening without, I think, being too upsetting.
It's an exploration of a history that, I mean, I didn't ever learn about this in school or anything. My only source of learning about this aspect of our country's heritage, maybe a darker part of our country's heritage, would be through reading this, and I think that's a really great thing for children to be able to get to grips with.
It's kind of quite noble of Morpurgo to take something that is a really difficult subject and not kind of shy away from it and be honest and say this happened, but here's this lovely kind of story from it, and how kind of heartwarming and how kind of amazing, if you will, can people be. People carry on even if it feels like everything's gone against them. So I think, like Hattie said, it is quite different, but I think actually it's a really great choice for adults and children.
And there are some lighter moments, in particular the middle section of the book. I don't want to give too many details away, but the character of Megs Malloy, who adopts the two boys.
Sort of menagerie of animals.
With her many animals. Do you want to tell me just a little bit about some of those sort of standout moments from the book for you, Hattie?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's sort of the whimsical element that I was going to mention earlier. It's kind of, what could be better as a child than being taken in when you've never felt at home anywhere before, never felt parented before, going into a haven where you're saved and you're completely surrounded by animals of these sort of varying personalities. You've got this wombat that just stinks to high heaven, who lives under who loves to steal hats. Just what a character, and without giving too much away, he's not in the book for that long a time, but you really get a sense of this environment as a really character defining moment for these two boys who who kind of escape to the sanctuary where they learn so much and they're given so much as well.
Just briefly talking about the middle part with all the animals and them being at Meg's Malloy's, when I was reading the book, it kind of gave me hope for them as a reader. And I just wanted to read on to kind of find out what does happen to them, because you start off the book in quite a dark place, and then when you get to this middle part, you think, oh, actually everything's going to be okay for these characters. I want it to be okay. So it just kind of grasped me that little bit more, that I just wanted to finish it so that I knew what happened to them.
It was definitely a page turner.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, and we've barely spoken about the second half of the book, which I think is equally as hopeful, equally as important, and equally as sort of inspiring, really, because you have this voyage that Ali undertakes on her own. She's another one of these female characters that's just incredibly strong-willed and very witty and interesting and defined as well as a character, which I think is really hard to do. And he does this through a really interesting sort of communication device of emails back and forth, and then her real feelings under the emails, which is quite a complex thing for a children's book, but he does it really well, and it comes across very clearly. There's the big motif of the albatross, which is, it's a nod to like classic literature in a way that might fly over, if you pardon the pun, a lot of children's heads. But there's also the theme of the Rime of the Ancient Mariner. There's the theme of London bridges falling down, and all these things, they connect and they cycle back and forth. And I just think that's so clever. I think that's a really clever thing to do well, and to weave in all this history and to weave in all this sort of literary elements. I think, it's a really fantastic book. I definitely recommend it to adult readers and younger readers alike.
To take something like Coleridge's Rime of the Ancient Mariner and make it accessible to children and kind of make it fun, because it's a tough, kind of big epic poem, and it's full of allegory and stuff, but to take that and make it fun and still make it relevant and make it work for children, I just think it's hugely impressive as an author, and I think it's a really cool book. So.
Okay, so we've been talking about 3 Michael Morpurgo books: Butterfly Lion, Alone on a Wide, Wide Sea, and The Amazing Story of Adolphus Tips, all published by HarperCollins, all of which are available from Hampshire Libraries and through our free download service, BorrowBooks. And if you've read any of the books we've talked about today, let us know what you think by clicking on the link in our podcast blurb, where you'll find details of all the books discussed. Thank you for listening to Love Your Library, the Hampshire Libraries podcast. Don't forget to subscribe if you want to hear other interviews and book recommendations. If you particularly enjoyed this episode and like the way that we concentrated on just one writer and included the book recommendations of the author that we spoke to, then let us know, because we can do more of that in future. If you tell us what you like, we'll make sure that we give you what you want to listen to.
Yeah, we always love to hear from you with any comments or thoughts, and we'll always read and respond to any questions or suggestions you got, so please send them in. And do let us know if you've read and enjoyed any of the books that we've talked about. It would be great if you'd rate and review our podcast on iTunes, as this helps other people find us.
Don't forget to come and see us. You'll always be welcomed, whether you're getting advice for your next book, attending an event, or taking part in one of our many clubs. The best thing you can do to support your local library is to use it. I'm Mary Stone.
And I'm Kate Price McCarthy.